Hello again, friends. I hope your coffee is steaming hot and your spirit feels light today. No matter how the weather rages outside your window, have you ever built a wall around your heart so thick that you believed nothing could ever break through, only to realize that wall wasn't blocking out the world, but actually locking you inside? In the winter of 1950, a lonely veteran named Darren Whitlock moved into Idaho's coldest valley and built a home that defied all reason. A cabin built inside another cabin, walls stuffed thick with moss and ash. His neighbors mocked him, calling him a fool. But when the temperature plunged to 45 degrees below zero and the wind roared like cannon fire, their laughter died away as the wealthy froze inside their grand homes. The so-called fool and his silver-coated German shepherd sat silently waiting for a knock at the door. A knock that would force a broken man to decide between his own safety and the life of his enemy. This is a story about bitter cold, unbreakable loyalty and the healing power of forgiveness. If you love gathering by the fire for tales like this, please tap that subscribe button gently and join our family. The year was 1950, and the autumn air in Idaho carried the iron edge of approaching winter. Darren Whitlock guided his rattling International Harvester pickup down the winding road into Stanley Valley. The heater in the cab was little more than a theory, blowing only a lukewarm breath against the creeping chill. Beside him on the battered bench seat sat Baron. Baron was a large German shepherd, his coat the color of weathered silver. In the looming storm clouds, the dog sat alert, ears rotating like radar dishes, absorbing the new world rushing past the window. Every now and then, a low hum would rise in Baron's chest, a sound Darren felt deep inside more than heard, acknowledging the vast and intimidating silhouette of the Sawtooth Mountains looming on the horizon. Like jagged teeth, they stood as two old soldiers seeking a quiet place to fade away. Darren was a former combat engineer, his hands still trembling when the nights became too silent. He carried the frozen weight of European forests deep in his soul. Baron, a retired scout dog, bore his own unseen scars, flinching at sudden loud noises that echoed the artillery of long ago. They both needed silence. They both needed isolation, and Stanley Valley, often called the icebox of the nation, promised just that. Darren pulled the truck off the dirt road at an overlook. The engine stuttered and died with a last cough, leaving an immediate silence to sweep in and fill the space vast and heavy. "Well, buddy?" Darren murmured, resting a rough hand on Baron's thick neck fur. "This is it, the final stop." Baron pressed his wet nose against Darren's palm and breathed out softly. Below them, the valley stretched wide, a basin dotted with golden grasses split by the shimmering ribbon of the Salmon River. It looked peaceful, almost inviting, bathed in the weak October sunlight. But Darren knew better. He knew that beauty often cloaks harsh cruelty. He had learned that hard lesson in the Ardennes. He shifted the truck back into gear. He understood that beauty often veiled cruelty, a truth he had come to know firsthand in the Ardennes. With resolve, he shifted the truck back into gear and made his way toward the small cluster of buildings that passed for the town of Stanley. His destination was the lumber yard. It was owned by Hiram Kerrigan, a man built like a barrel with eyes that constantly sized up the worth of whatever they rested on. He stood on the porch of his office, wiping sawdust from his hands as Darren approached. Mr. Whitlock, Hiram called out, his voice booming with forced cheerfulness. "Didn't think you'd actually make the drive up today." "Crisp air, isn't it, Mr. Kerrigan?" Darren replied, in a voice roughened by disuse. Baron stayed close by his left knee, his golden eyes locked unwaveringly on the lumberman. Hiram took a half step back, his smile flickering for just a moment. "Fine animal," he muttered, clearing his throat. "Anyway, the papers are all ready. That 40 acres by the creek bend, you've got the cash." Darren nodded, producing an envelope thick with bills, everything he had left in this world. Inside the dusty office, Hiram spread out a map. His thick finger jabbed at a wedge of land nestled against the northern slope of the valley. "Right there. Cheapest land in Custer County. Though I have to warn you again as a friend, Whitlock, that spot's a little exposed." Hiram's private thoughts were far less kind. He knew that land by a harsher name. The locals called it the Funnel. The surrounding hills funneled the brutal winter winds straight through that 40-acre plot. It was a death trap of drifting snow and biting sub-zero wind chills. Hiram had sold that land 3 times before, and every buyer had abandoned it before spring thaw, broken by the relentless cold. Hiram fully intended to reclaim the deed when this quiet, haunted veteran inevitably fled or froze. He would gladly take whatever cabin the fool managed to build as interest. "It will serve my purposes," Darren said softly, signing his name with steady resolve. He knew Hiram thought he was a fool, a city man chasing a romantic dream. Darren didn't care. He wasn't seeking comfort. He was searching for a fortress. With the deal done, Darren drove to Lawson's general store to gather supplies. The store smelled of feed corn leather and stale coffee. A group of local men huddled around a pot-bellied stove in the corner, their conversations fading as Darren entered. Sam Lawson, a thin man with wireframe glasses, stood behind the counter. "Can I help you, stranger?" Darren pulled a list from his pocket. "I need 80 pounds of agricultural lime, 4 spools of heavy-gauge baling wire, and 20 pounds of galvanized nails." The request hung in the air, and from the corner by the stove, a sharp, mocking laugh burst out from one of the men. "Lime and wire," the man called out, grinning. "Planning on farming rocks, Mr. Winter's coming? You should be buying every cord of firewood Sam has out back." Barron, who'd been sitting patiently near the door, growled a low, warning rumble deep in his throat. The laughing man by the stove fell silent. Darren ignored the jab and just looked at Sam. "You got it." Sure, Sam said, eyeing Barron nervously, just an unusual order for a man starting out in October. They all thought he was foolish that he didn't understand the cold. Darren almost smiled. No one knew the cold better than he did. He knew it was a patient killer. Every crack and every weak spot had been discovered, and firewood was merely fighting a battle he was destined to lose. His aim was to create something that wouldn't have to struggle. An hour later, Darren and Barron stood firm on their land. The sun was already sinking behind the mountain peaks, casting long, bruised, purple shadows across the valley floor. The wind here was unlike the town's. Constant, steady, a relentless force that chilled the skin in an instant. Barron didn't dash off to explore. The big dog stayed glued to Darren, his body taut, turning his head toward the narrow canyon to the north, the very source of the wind. The fur along Barron's spine rose sharply. The dog let out a high, thin whine filled with ancient anxiety, sensing what the humans failed to see. "This place doesn't want us here," Darren whispered. "I know, boy," kneeling to press his hands into Barron's thick, rough fur. "It's a bad spot, that's why it's ours." Rising, he moved to the center of the future building site. There was no time for a proper foundation before the freeze hit hard. He'd have to depend on driven posts. Darren grabbed a heavy sledgehammer and pulled the first thick cedar post from the truck bed. Marking the earth, he wasn't just constructing a cabin. He was raising a defensive line. The sharp clang of steel hammering wood rang out through the empty valley. Barron flinched at the noise but stood his ground. Darren planted the first corner post, then stepped a foot outward, marking the spot for the next post, driving it down to form a second wall, just 1 foot beyond the first. He was building a double barrier, an insane amount of extra labor for a lone man. Staring down the approach of winter, any local passing by would surely attest that Hiram Kerrigan had stumbled upon the biggest fool ever to set foot in Idaho. Yet as Darren swung the hammer, sweat beading despite the biting wind, he never felt foolish. For the first time since the war ended, a spark of control flickered within him. Let the wind howl, let the snow fall. He would carve out a sanctuary the world couldn't shake him, and barren against the merciless winter. Days in Stanley Valley shortened the sun, retreating behind the sawtooth peaks earlier, with every afternoon. As if it too feared the creeping darkness, Darren Whitlock worked with relentless intensity, teetering on obsession. To the few locals speeding past on the distant road, he seemed like a madman wrestling invisible demons in the dirt, and in a way he was. Darren waded knee-deep in the icy creek waters that fed into the Salmon River, his hands red and numb, barely registering the sting. He was gathering moss, massive dripping clumps clinging to river rocks. Beside him on the bank, Darren paced, barking sharp warning notes at squirrels chattering in the pines, making sure the perimeter stayed secure. Once, Darren loaded the truck bed with the wet green weight and drove back to the site where the skeleton of the double wall awaited. A strange hollow rib cage of cedar posts and rough-sawn lumber. It was this stage that baffled the locals the most. At the general store, Sam Lawson had mocked the mix of lime and wire, but Darren trusted his chemistry just as deeply as his carpentry skills. He set up a large metal trough near the cabin frame, dumping in the moss with deliberation. Mixing it with dry prairie grass he'd carefully cut from the meadow, Darren whispered, "Watch closely, Baron." Next, he poured a bag of white agricultural lime over the blend, then added a bucket of graywood ash. He'd gathered the ash from his campfire, sharing the secret. Quietly, you can't just cram grass into a wall. Mice will burrow, bugs will devour it, and the rot will turn it to mush in just a couple of years. Baron sat back on his haunches, tilting his head thoughtfully. The dog's gaze never left Darren's hands, as if engraving the formula into memory. Darren started stirring the mix with a shovel, coating every strand with the caustic preserving dust, the lime and ash to dry it out, he explained. His breath steamed in the cold air as he worked hard. This makes it bitter. Nothing wants to live in it. Nothing dares to eat it. It preserves the fibers, keeps it light, holds the air inside. He paused, leaning on the shovel, meeting Baron's steady eyes. That's the enemy, Baron? When wood meets wood, heat slips right through. We're building a thermal break. The inner wall stays warm. The outer wall freezes, but the air trapped between keeps the two apart. Baron gave a low, understanding woof. Darren's eyes stayed fixed on the dark tree line as he began the slow, careful task of stuffing the treated mixture into the 12-inch cavity between the two walls. He packed it gently, mindful not to squash it too tight. It had to stay fluffy to trap dead air. Methodically, he grabbed a handful, stuffed the gap, tamped it down, then repeated the process. The damp moss mingled with the sharp, acrid bite of wood ash, filling the air with an earthy, wet scent. Suddenly, the golden glow of the Idaho afternoon softened the valley's biting wind, replaced by the heavy, moist stillness of a distant forest. 4,000 miles away, the year was 1944. The month November, deep in the Hurtgen forest on Germany's border. Darren was no longer a 50-year-old man building a cabin. He was a sergeant in the combat engineers, shivering low in a foxhole, a pit barely more than a muddy grave carved into the frozen earth. Above them, shattered trees lay broken, shattered by relentless artillery. "Sarge, I can't feel my feet." The voice was young, heartbreakingly, unbearably young. That was Danny, a kid from Ohio who'd lied about his age just to enlist. Only 18, but looking no older than 15. Darren glanced over to see Danny curled in the corner of their foxhole, wrapped in a sodden wool blanket reeking of wet dog and cordite, his lips a ghostly pale blue. "Keep moving," Danny Darren whispered, the tight grip of fear pressing on his own heart. "Wiggle your toes, rub your hands together. Don't stop moving." It wasn't the Germans that haunted them that night. It was the merciless cold. A sleet storm had sealed the world in icy chains. No shelter, no fire, no warmth allowed, because enemy spotters watched too close. They were utterly exposed. Darren had done all he could to strengthen their refuge. He lined the bottom of the foxhole with pine branches, hoping to shield them from the relentless mud. Yet the mud seeped in cold and unforgiving. He tried to pile leaves along the hole's edges to block the biting wind, but the damp leaves froze solid, turning into icy slabs that stole every ounce of warmth from their bodies. He was an engineer, trained to build bridges, clear minefields, and erect defenses. But here, trapped in this hole, he found he couldn't construct the single thing they desperately needed: warmth. "It's so cold, Sarge," Danny murmured, eyes heavy with exhaustion. "It's inside me. Feels like swallowing a blade," he whispered. Darren, unbuttoning his own tunic, pulled Danny close, trying desperately to share his body heat. "Hold on, kid." The sun will rise in 4 hours, just 4 hours. But their bond of warmth was broken, the cold pressing like a crushing weight around them, squeezing the very life from the air they breathed. Darren sensed his own heat draining away, seeping into the freezing mud, into the sodden wool, disappearing into the indifferent forest around them. He held the boy tight, stroking Danny's back, spinning stories of warm Kansas summers, the waving wheat fields, the asphalt shimmering in July's heat. He tried to build a fortress of words against the winter's bite. Around 3 a.m., the shivering stopped. Exhausted and overtaken by hypothermia, Darren had slipped into a foggy unconsciousness until he jolted awake. The silence inside the foxhole roared louder than any gunfire. "Danny?" No answer. The boy sagged heavily against his shoulder, stiff and cold. In the pale gray dawn, Darren saw Danny's face peaceful. The pain was gone. The blue tint on his lips had faded to the cold, lifeless white of marble. The winter had claimed him. It had shattered Darren's fragile defenses and taken the boy away. Oh, a scream clawed its way up Darren's throat, a raw, jagged agony, but he was too numb to release it. He stayed there, clutching the frozen form of the boy he had vowed to protect, while the cruel German winter whispered mockingly through the trees. Darren, a faint, persistent whine cut through his mind. He blinked, and the gray Hurtgen forest dissolved. He was back in Idaho, on his knees in the dirt, clutching a handful of lime-covered moss so tightly his knuckles turned white. Tremors shook his body, rattling his teeth. Baron the big dog pressed his chest against Darren's side, nudging his damp nose beneath his arm, gently lifting his head. Baron let out a sharp, commanding sound from his throat, nudging Darren's chin, his golden eyes brimming with concern. The dog sensed the change, the rush of stress hormones, old fears rising anew. Darren gasped, drawing in the thin mountain air, dropping the moss as he buried his face in Baron's fur, breathing in the warmth of a living creature, warm, musky, and real. "I'm here," Darren whispered, voice breaking. "I'm here, Baron. We're safe." He stayed there in silence for a long time, letting the steady rhythm of the dog's heartbeat anchor him to the present moment, back to the year 1950. Slowly the trembling eased, but the memory lingered, settling deep into the set line of Darren's jaw. He rose to his feet and looked upon the wall before him. It was no longer just a structure, but a heavy penance he vowed to bear. Darren vowed silently to the barren valley, a promise forged in resolve never again. He hoisted the shovel with grim determination. This wasn't mere labor, it was a battle. He assaulted the task, treating the moss with extra lime and ash, packing it in with meticulous precision. Every inch was scrutinized as he searched for cracks, envisioning the cold as a relentless foe, a soldier wielding a bayonet, hunting for a breach. And he was bent on sealing every opening. This wall would serve two masters physically. It would shatter the brutal Idaho wind's assault. It would forge a sanctuary where the temperature never plummeted below, freezing. A place where no one would ever again turn blue and quiet in the night. But beyond that, the wall held a deeper purpose. As it rose higher, enclosing the small space, it shielded more than just the cold. Darren felt a grim relief settle deep within him. Yes, he was barricading the chill, but also shutting the world out. He was blocking the pity gleaming in Sam Lawson's eyes, stamping out the haunting memories of war, and closing the door on any chance of getting close to another soul who might freeze and slip away in his arms. He glanced at Baron lounging in a patch of sunlight. "Just you and me, Baron," he said, stuffing a handful of insulation into a corner post. "We don't need anyone else. People are fragile," he added softly. "Walls, though they're tough." He explained the science to the dog, again voice gaining strength as he lectured to quiet the echoes of Danny's voice in his mind. "See, barren air molecules are the best insulators if they stay still, but if they move, they carry heat away." Darren went on. "That's convection. We have to trap that air. We have to cage it so it can't run." He worked until the sun slid behind the mountains and shadows bruised the sky in deep purples. His hands were raw, his back screaming, but the first stretch of the wall stood filled and firm. To Hiram Kerrigan, it would look crude, thick, and strange, a waste of good wood. Around here, locals might have branded it madness, but for Darren, running his hand over the rough planks, feeling the solid mass he'd built, it was something he hadn't felt in 6 long years. It was safety. He kindled a small fire by the truck. As stars pierced the heavy darkness above, he warmed a can of beans and shared the meal with Barron. The dog devoured the food, then curled at Darren's feet, his back pressed against Darren's boots. Darren gazed at the half-finished fortress. The ghost of Danny hovered at the edge of the firelight, but now the wall stood firmly between them. "Tomorrow we finish the north side," Darren told Barron softly. "That's where the wind cuts hardest." Barron exhaled a long, contented sigh and closed his eyes. Darren leaned back against the tire of the truck, watching his breath billow into the frigid night air. It rose, then vanished, but inside the double wall he knew the air would hold still. November crept into Stanley Valley, not with a thunderous roar, but a haunting, suffocating quiet. Meteorologists called it an inversion, but to the old-timers of the Sawtooth Mountains, it was simply the lid. The sky was a dazzling, deceptive blue, stripped bare of even the wispiest cloud. The sun glinted with a hard, diamond brilliance, offering no warmth, and the cold air refused to rise. Denser and heavier than the warm air above it, sank down into the valley floor like water flooding a basin, trapped beneath the atmospheric lid, compressed and contained. This turned the entire valley into a pressurized freezer. Darren Whitlock stood on his porch, his breath billowing out before him in thick, lingering clouds that stubbornly refused to fade. He watched the smoke curling from Sam Lawson's chimney down in the village below. Instead of rising into the sky, the gray column slammed against an invisible ceiling about 50 feet up, then spread out flat. It spilled horizontally like a broken wave, unnatural, unsettling, and sent chills down Darren's spine beneath his flannel shirt and heavy wool coat. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt even heavier, but for a different reason. Barron was nowhere to be found. Usually the German shepherd patrolled the perimeter, checking snow depths or lay by the wood stove. Today the main room was empty. Darren called out, his voice echoing too loudly in the stillness, and from the bedroom came a low, trembling whimper in reply. Entering, Darren found Barron squeezed as tight as possible beneath the narrow iron cot. The dog trembled, his body curled into a defensive ball paws pressed firmly over his nose. His dark eyes were wide, revealing the whites all around. Darren knelt down, feeling the cold floorboards seep through his pants. "Hey buddy, what's wrong? What's out there?" Barron let out another soft, high-pitched whine of distress, but refused to emerge. Darren realized it wasn't something outside, it was what was happening to the very air itself. The barometric pressure was plunging. To humans, it might feel like a dull headache or an ache in an old injury. For a combat dog nerves already frayed by the blast of artillery, the sudden pressure drop was like a warning signal, a physical prelude to an attack. The air grew heavier, pressing down on the earth, a sign that something violent was bearing down on them. "It's just the weather," Darren murmured, reaching beneath the cot to stroke Barron's flank. The dog's fur was hot, muscles tense with quiet panic. No mortars, no 8/8s, just the wind coming to check in. He stayed there for 20 minutes, whispering soft reassurances. Slowly, the tremors in Barron's body eased into a steady rhythm of breathing. Though Barron didn't come out, he rested his chin on his paws, trusting Darren to keep watch. Darren rose, knees cracking, and checked the old brass thermometer hanging by the door. The needle had dropped sharply since morning, plunging deep into the stormy zone. The inversion was the eerie calm before the storm's fury. Suddenly, the heavy grind of an engine shattered the silence outside. Rising, Darren stepped onto the porch as a massive red logging truck rumbled past his property line. The truck slowed, tires crunching loudly over frozen gravel, and then came to a stop. Hiram Kerrigan rolled down his window, sending a wave of heat spilling into the icy air. His face was flushed, cheeks red from the cold, his fur-lined cap pushed back atop his head. Afternoon Whitlock Hiram called out, his voice carrying effortlessly through the thin air. Darren nodded once, leaning against the doorframe, crossing his arms and tucking his hands into his armpits to hold on to warmth. Hiram leaned out further to get a better look at the cabin. Folding his arms tightly, pressing his hands into his armpits to conserve warmth, Hiram leaned out, his gaze fixed on the cabin. The double wall was complete now, giving the structure a strange, bulky appearance with its deep eaves. The walls were twice as thick as any ordinary house, lending it a squat, fortified look, I have to admit. Hiram chuckled, though his laugh lacked real amusement. "That's the ugliest damn thing I've ever laid eyes on in this valley. It looks like a house stuffed into a fat suit," Hiram said. Darren didn't bite. "It's thick for a reason, Hiram." "Waste of lumber," Hiram sneered. He motioned with a gloved thumb toward his own land, visible a mile down the road. "See that woodpile, Whitlock? I've got 10 cords of seasoned pine all stacked high. That's how you survive an Idaho winter burn, fast burn hot. Wood warms twice, they say. Once when you chop it, and again when you burn it." Darren glanced at Hiram's home, miles away, a beautiful sight. Classic log construction, tall and commanding. But Darren saw it through the eyes of an engineer, not an artist. He noticed how the logs had settled over the years, the chinking likely cracked from dry summer heat. Only a single layer of wood stood between Hiram's family and the harsh elements. "Wood shrinks when it gets cold," Darren said evenly. "When the temperature plunges to 30 below, those logs of yours will contract. The chinking will pull away. You won't have walls anymore, you'll have a sieve." Hiram's grin faded. "I've lived here 20 years, soldier. I think I know how a log cabin works. Enjoy your bunker, just try not to suffocate in there." As snow began to cover that small chimney with a grinding clash of gears, Hiram rolled up the window and sped off. The truck belched a thick cloud of black diesel smoke that spread out flat under the inversion layer, staining the pristine air. Darren watched him disappear. 10 cords of wood was an enormous stockpile of potential heat energy, but Hiram was heating the whole valley, battling the cold with brute force. Darren planned to fight it with science. He returned inside and locked the door. The encounter with Hiram had sharpened his resolve. The barometer had dropped another fraction. The battle was beginning in earnest. For the rest of the afternoon, Darren worked with precise determination. First, he tackled the windows, the weakest point in the thermal barrier. Double panes were already installed, but that wasn't enough for what the barometer was warning. He grabbed thick wooden shutters he'd crafted from scrap planks, then hinged them outside the window frames. Before mounting, he lined each shutter with heavy wool felt, scavenged from an old army surplus blanket. When closed and latched, the wool would press tight against the window frame, sealing it like a gasket. Darren finally emerged from beneath the cot as the sun dipped low, his dog sticking close to Darren's legs, mirroring his every move. Hungry Darren looked down. Darren didn't wag his tail. He just glanced at the door, then back at Darren. "Yeah, me neither." The final task lay ahead, the most vital. The chimney of fire needs oxygen to burn. It draws air from the room, consumes it, and sends hot exhaust up the flue. In a normal house, this creates a vacuum-sucking cold air in through every crack in the walls to replace the air escaping up the chimney. In an ordinary house, this would create a vacuum pulling cold air through every crack in the walls to replace the warm air escaping up the chimney. It was a relentless cycle of wasted energy. Darren knelt beside his cast-iron stove, holding a piece of galvanized metal he had cut earlier, with tin snips, the blades rasping in a dull, steady rhythm. He carefully fashioned a circular plate, drilling a hole through its center, and attaching a sturdy steel rod. Rather than a simple damper, he was crafting a precision instrument. He installed it firmly into the stovepipe. The fit was so exact that when closed, the damper was nearly airtight. Most folks usually left their dampers wide open. Darren spoke softly to Barron, whose eyes were locked on the task with a mix of intensity and worry. They let all the heat escape straight to the sky. But tonight we're going to starve the fire just enough to keep the warmth right here with us. He struck a match, and the kindling caught fire with a gentle whoosh. the flames eagerly licking the wood. Darren slowly turned his newly made damper's handle inch by inch, eyeing the fire's every flicker. When the flames shifted from a roaring orange blaze to a slow, lazy blue dance, he knew to stop. The fire was burning fiercely, but the draft had been tamed. The heat radiated steadily into the room held captive by the stove's thermal mass. The warm air refused to escape up the pipe. Night fell like a shroud, the temperature outside plunging with cruel swiftness. Darren could hear the wooden porch beams groaning and popping as the fibers contracted in the brutal freeze. The cold struck like distant rifle fire, echoing through the stillness. Inside the double walls, though, there was silence. The dense inversion air pressed hard against the cabin's exterior, desperate to find a way in. But the lime-treated moss and the dead air trapped between the walls stood firm, drawing a solid line against the cold. Darren settled into his armchair, a blanket draped over his legs, finding quiet strength in the moment. Barron climbed up, resting his heavy head gently in Darren's lap. The dog trembled faintly, sensing the unseen pressure squeezing the valley. Darren placed his hand firmly on Barron's head, feeling the comforting warmth beneath his palm. His eyes drifted to the thermometer mounted on the wall, positioned away from the stove's heat. It read 65 degrees inside, while beyond these walls the world was turning to frozen stone. Out in the valley, Hiram Kerrigan was likely tossing endless logs onto his roaring fire, standing with his back scorched and his front frozen, baffled by tonight's fierce draft. Darren closed his eyes, knowing this fortress was sealed tight. The air was heavy, yes, but in here it belonged to them. They were ready. Then came the onslaught an hour after sunset. It didn't build slowly, it slammed into them like a brutal blow. The pressure system that had long weighed down the Stanley Valley finally shattered, unleashing a scream of wind roaring down from the sawtooth peaks. Like an avalanche of invisible ice, it barreled through the night sky. Inside the double-walled cabin, the first sign was a deep, ominous. At last the valley gave way, and the wind roared fiercely down from the jagged peaks. It swept through like a silent avalanche of unseen ice rattling within the double-walled cabin. The first sign, a deep rumble. The floorboards trembled with a deep resonance before a sound broke through, a sharp, piercing shriek that quickly swelled into a booming roar, a relentless, thunderous rumble that eerily echoed the heavy artillery barrages Darren Whitlock had endured in the European theater. The wind slammed into the cabin's northern face. The force was so fierce the entire building seemed to hold its breath for a fleeting moment, testing the strength of the cedar beams and the lime-infused moss packed tightly between them. Barron, who had been resting by the stove, scrambled upright, his claws scraping desperately against the wooden floor. A sharp, frantic sound broke the tension. The dog's ears flattened tightly against his skull tail tucked far beneath him. To a human, it was just the wind, but to Barron, the retired scout dog, it was something far more. The thunderous impact against the walls was indistinguishable from the blast of mortar fire. The ghost of war had returned. Barron yelped in sharp panic and bolted not toward the door, but seeking refuge, squeezing his powerful, wolf-like frame into the darkness. Beneath the heavy oak dining table in the center of the room, hidden in the shadows. From the darkness, Darren heard the dog's rapid, ragged breathing. He stood watching the shutter brace the unseen onslaught. He glanced at the table, and then at the trembling shadow beneath it. Without hesitation, the 50-year-old veteran dropped to his knees. His joints creaked, softly lost beneath the howling storm outside as he crawled under the table. Sitting cross-legged on the cold floor beside the trembling dog, the seasoned soldier whispered calmly, "I've got you. The high ground is safe." Barron immediately pressed his full weight against Darren's side. The dog shivered so violently Darren's own teeth rattled. He wrapped an arm gently around Barron's neck. Burying his face in the thick fur behind the dog's ears, he caught the clean scent of the animal mingled with the faint dust of the floorboards. They sat in silence under the table's shadow, two survivors of a war officially over 5 years before. but never truly quiet in their minds. Outside, the wind roared like a runaway freight train, tearing at the eaves, searching desperately for any crack or gap. But there was no entrance. After nearly 20 minutes, Darren realized something profound. The noise was terrifying, yes, but the air around them stayed still. The candle on the table flickered only slightly from vibration, not a draft. "Listen to that, Baron," Darren murmured, stroking the dog's flank with long, steady strokes. "It's furious. It wants to break in to freeze us. But it can't." Baron's breathing slowed. He raised his head. Licking Darren's chin with a tentative rough tongue, the dog searched his eyes for reassurance. "It's not shelling just the wind," Darren said firmly. "Just wind and snow. We built a fortress. Remember?" Darren crawled out and grabbed a small, leather-bound notebook and pencil. Sitting back down, leaning against the table leg with Baron resting his head on his thigh, Darren opened the notebook to a fresh page. He glanced at the thermometer fixed to the interior wall, time 2100 hours. Date, just wind and snow. "We built a fortress," Darren recalled as he crawled from beneath the table and grabbed a small, leather-bound notebook and a pencil. He settled back on the floor, leaning against the table leg, with Baron resting his head gently on Darren's thigh. Opening the notebook to a blank page, he glanced at the thermometer fixed to the interior wall. The time 9 p.m., the date clearly marked. November 12th, 1950. Outside, a fierce blizzard raged with wind gusts pushing 60 miles per hour. Inside, the temperature held steady at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 118 degrees on the stove's gauge. 2 logs had been burned since sunset. He noted the numbers with a grim sense of relief, trusting the science. The dead air trapped between the walls acted like a barrier, the thermal seal flawlessly intact. The room was so quiet he could hear the pencil scratching softly on the paper, yet just a mile down the valley. In the grand log home of Hiram Kerrigan, silence was nowhere to be found, only chaos filled the air. The Kerrigan house was a majestic fortress crafted from massive ponderosa pines. In summer, a tribute to frontiersman might. But tonight, beneath the brutal weight of the storm's fury, it was faltering. Hiram stood before his immense stone fireplace, his face stained with soot and twisted with frustration, bundled in his heavy winter coat inside his own living room. Snatching a split log of seasoned fir, he flung it into the firebox, shouting, "Burn, damn it!" Flames roared, devouring the wood with ravenous urgency. But it made no difference, just as Darren had warned. The relentless cold caused the massive logs to shrink, pulling away from the mortar and chinking. Hundreds of invisible, hair-thin cracks had opened across the windward wall. The wind needed no door. It forced itself through the tiniest seams, blasting jets of freezing air that sliced through the room. The house was losing heat faster than the fire could replace it. And worse, the shifting pressure was tearing the chimney apart. A sudden gale slammed down the flue, overpowering the updraft. A choking cloud of acrid gray smoke spilled back into the living room, stinging eyes and throat alike. Mason Hiram shouted above the wailing wind, "Get more towels, stuff them into the windowsills." Mason Hiram's son knelt by the north window, desperately stuffing bath towels into the icy gaps already forming on the glass. "It's not working, Dad," Mason yelled back, panic creeping into his voice. "The wind's cutting through the walls themselves. I can feel it crawling in this corner." Crouched on the sofa beneath a heap of quilt sat Olivia Kerrigan and her daughter-in-law, Kira. Kira rocked gently, tears slipping quietly. Nestled in Kira's arms, wrapped in triple layers of wool, was baby Jack, just 3 months old. He wasn't crying, and that silenced Kira with fear beyond words. "He's so cold," she whispered. Pulling back the blanket to check on him, Jack ceased fussing. Olivia leaned in, raising a kerosene lantern closer. The flickering light threw harsh shadows across the baby's face. Jack's eyes were closed, his breaths shallow and quick. But it was the color of his skin that made Olivia's heart freeze around his delicate, perfect mouth. The skin had turned a pale, waxy blue. Hiram Olivia screamed, her voice slicing through the roar of the wind and crackling fire. Look at the baby." Hiram ripped his gaze from the fireplace heat burning his back, while his face went icy cold, rushing to the sofa to see his grandson lethargic and fading. The bitter wind slicing through the house was stealing warmth from his small frame faster than his body could generate it. He was slipping into the first waves of hypothermia right there in his grandfather's living room. Just 10 feet away from a blazing fire, Hiram felt a chilling dread settle deep in his gut, something far darker than the cold. It was the ruthless grip of terror tightening around him. Commanding his voice despite the tremble, Hiram clutched the baby tightly to his chest. Trying to share his own warmth, he urged Stoke that fire Mason hotter. "I can't get it any hotter, Pa." Mason yelled back, frustration making his hands rise in defeat. "We're burning the wood as fast as we can, but the heat just keeps disappearing." Hiram's eyes scanned the house. Smoke lingered in the air like a heavy gray veil, and the curtains flickered, moved by cold drafts slipping through walls that should have been solid. The wind danced around the expensive furniture, the gleaming trophies on the wall, his proud achievements, yet it all seemed pointless now. The memory of their fence-line conversation haunted him. He recalled taunting the veteran mocking the house by saying it looked like it was wearing a fat suit. He looked down at the frost beginning to spread on the inside logs, delicate white, crystalline patterns blooming on the wood he had cut with his own hands. The sieve Hiram whispered the echo of Darren's warning bouncing through his mind. It's a sieve. Meanwhile, in the fortress, the atmosphere was calm and isolated. Darren had paused his writing. He was peeling an orange he'd bought from Sam Lawson's store. The sharp citrus scent filled the small cabin, masking the storm's scent. Baron the dog had finally fallen asleep, twitching slightly as he chased dream rabbits, his paws rhythmically moving against the floor. He no longer hid under the table. Instead, he lay stretched out on the rug, exposed and completely at ease. Darren savored a segment of the orange, its sweetness a small comfort. Glancing at the thermometer, he saw it had climbed to 66 degrees Fahrenheit. He actually had to ease off the stove. He was burning way too much wood he needed to conserve. His gaze fell on the notebook lying open on the floor where he'd jotted wind velocity, increasing. Structure holding strong. No drafts detected. "Baron is calm," he wrote quietly, closing the book. Darren had no idea what was unfolding down in the valley below. He assumed the locals were shivering in frustration, crowding near their stoves. Burning through their winter supplies at a frightening pace, he felt a flicker of vindication, pride in his work as an engineer. Yet he didn't know about the baby, didn't see the faint blue tint on tiny lips, nor the despair written in a mother's tears. Had he known, the wall he'd painstakingly built around his heart might have crumbled then and there, but he didn't know. He was safe, warm and alone. Outside, the wind reached a deafening roar, an angry rage shaking the very earth. Yet inside the double walls, the only sounds were the steady breathing of a sleeping dog and the gentle turning of a page. Darren Whitlock leaned his head back against the chair and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, winter could not touch him. But as he drifted toward sleep, he didn't see the ghostly face of his fallen comrade Danny. Instead, he saw the smug grin of Hiram Kerrigan laughing in the sunlight. "Stay warm." Hiram Darren whispered into the darkness, "I hope you gathered enough wood." He closed his eyes for the first time in years, feeling the winter's icy grip loosen. At last, it couldn't touch him. Yet as sleep crept in, he didn't see his fallen friend Danny's face. Instead, it was the brazen grin of Hiram Kerrigan, basking in sunlight. "Stay warm," Hiram Darren whispered into the shadows. "Hope you've got enough wood." The storm unleashed its fury, caring nothing for the pride of men or the fragility of newborns. It sought only balance, striving to make the warmth inside as cold as the brutal chill outside one house it claimed. But at the other home it met its match. The mercury in the thermometer by the kitchen window had long since receded deep into its bulb, as if trying to vanish from this cruel world. Designed to measure the Stanley Valley's temperature, it had plunged to a staggering 45 degrees below zero. At such a merciless cold, normal life laws no longer applied, as the very air became solid, and moisture instantly turned to stone. The Kerrigan homestead, forged from resilient ponderosa pine, was no longer a refuge. It groaned like a dying beast, its wooden frame tightening under the cruel weight of the freeze. Inside the kitchen, the sound was subtle, but sliced through the tense silence between gusts of wind, like a gunshot. A heavy ceramic pitcher filled with water just an hour before suddenly shattered on the sideboard, as the water froze with such violent speed that its expansion shattered the pottery to pieces. Amidst the fragments of blue and white porcelain stood a solid block of ice. Hiram Kerrigan stared at its ruin. He watched as the icy block exposed to the cold drafts in the room began to crack even further, turning cloudy and opaque. Its inside he whispered the heavy truth settling in his gut, heavier than any burden before the winter had invaded their home. In the living room, chaos reigned. Mason Kerrigan, usually a pillar of strength, looked like a man drowning against an unstoppable tide. With nothing but a teaspoon, he knelt by the north wall, a pile of rags and towels at his side. Desperately, he stuffed the fabric into gaps where the chinking had pulled away between the logs. "It won't hold!" Mason shouted, his voice cracking with rising panic. Pushing a towel into a gap where the wind howled loudest, the chilling draft immediately stiffened, pushing the wet fabric back out, as if the house itself rejected the repair. Mason yanked his hand free. His fingers were raw and bleeding skin torn from the harsh wood and biting cold. "Pa, the wood's shrinking too fast, I can't stop it." He gasped, his desperation clear. Hiram turned away from the kitchen and glanced at his family. Kira sat curled on the sofa, wrapped in every quilt they owned, rocking back and forth with a rhythm born of pure terror. Cradled in her arms was baby Jack, frighteningly still. Heavy boots echoed hollowly across the frozen floorboards as Hiram approached. He pulled back the blanket's corner. Jack's face was the color of old parchment. The bluish tint around his lips had darkened to a bruised purple, and his breathing was shallow, a faint rattling gasp that faltered every few seconds. Beside Kira sat Olivia, Hiram's wife of 30 years, a woman forged of iron, a true frontier matriarch who had endured drought, flood, and the Great Depression. But now she looked small. She was a frontier matriarch, hardened by droughts, floods, and the Great Depression. But now in this moment she seemed small, her eyes glazed over, unfocused, fixated on the unlit kerosene lamp resting on the table. Her hands shook violently. "Hiram!" she whispered, teeth chattering. "I can't feel my feet. I can't feel my feet anymore." A wave of nausea swept through Hiram as the fire in the grand stone hearth blazed fiercely, devouring wood at a staggering pace. The heat, however, was sucked straight up the chimney, or stolen by hundreds of unseen air daggers piercing the walls. Now the flames were consuming the furniture. The dining chairs vanished first, then the side table. Yet it wasn't enough. The house was losing its battle. The unforgiving laws of nature in the valley had overpowered the elegance of the architecture. If they stayed, death awaited. It was an undeniable truth. By dawn, the fire would die out, and the sheriff would stumble upon 5 frozen statues. In the pale morning light, Hiram gazed past the frost-covered window pane. Beyond a swirling white void engulfed everything, the storm was a relentless whiteout, a blizzard of legendary wrath. He thought of the only other refuge in the valley, the monstrous bunker, the fortress erected by the warped veteran Darren Whitlock. He recalled its location, a lonely mile down the road, buried deep in snow, battered by a wind chill that could seize flesh in minutes. A dark, pragmatic thought slithered cold and sharp like a serpent in Hiram's mind. Darren Whitlock was probably dead. A stranger broken and isolated in his moss and straw-filled shelter. Hiram had sold him that land precisely because it was deemed unlivable. If the Grand Kerrigan house was failing, surely the veteran's shack had crumbled hours ago. Surely the man sat frozen stiff in his chair. Beside him, the wolf-like dog loyal to his side. Hiram glanced at baby Jack's purple lips. If Darren was gone, the house would stand empty. But if it still stood, it meant shelter. Hiram wouldn't need to ask for it. He wouldn't have to plead. He would claim the refuge the dead man no longer needed. He'd break down the door, drag out the body if necessary, and put his family somewhere warm. It was a savage thought, the mind of a scavenger. But as Hiram looked at his fading grandson, the morals of civilization vanished, leaving only the raw will to survive. "Get up," Hiram commanded, voice flat, unfamiliar, even to himself. Mason lifted his tear-frozen face from the floor. "Get up," Hiram shouted, gripping Mason's collar and pulling him to his feet. "We have to go now," Olivia whispered, terror creeping into her voice. "Hiram, we can't go out there, we'd freeze to death." "We're already freezing here, Livy," Hiram said, gripping her shoulders, shaking her gently. "Look at the baby. Look at him, he won't survive another hour." Turning back to the room, he ordered, "Put on everything, coats, layered on coats, scarves over your faces. No skin should be visible." Hiram went to the utility closet and grabbed a thick coil of hemp rope. Returning to the living room, he began tying knots, his hands moving with practiced precision. "We rope up," Hiram said, his movements as swift and sure as a man who had spent decades rigging logging loads. "Mason, take the rear. Kira, hold the baby close inside your coat, right against your skin. Olivia, you're ahead of Mason. I'll take the lead." "Where are we headed?" Kira asked, her voice thin and shaking, directed toward the veterans' shelter. Hiram never revealed his doubts about what they'd find. He didn't want them to know they were walking toward what might be a tomb. Mason argued back, "That place is a joke. Even you said so yourself." But Hiram was wrong. Maybe a lie or maybe not. He silently prayed to a god he hadn't spoken to in years, hoping he was mistaken. "It's standing. It has to be." Preparation took 10 agonizing minutes, leaving them looking like shapeless bundles of wool and leather. Hiram wrapped the rope around his waist, then Olivia's, then Kira's, and lastly Mason's, a lifeline of desperate souls linked together. Bound by 20 feet of hemp, Hiram approached the heavy oak door, feeling the chill leak deep through the wood. He glanced back at his family, terrified, and shaking eyes wide above their scarves. "Don't stop!" Hiram's voice was steel. "No matter what happens, keep moving. If you fall, get back up. If you can't stand, crawl. Stopping is the same as dying." He gripped the iron latch. It was bitter cold against his glove. Drawing a deep breath, he braced his shoulder against the door. Then he threw the bolt open, nearly knocking Hiram off his feet. Snow exploded into the hallway, swirling immediately into a white tornado. The roar was deafening, a crushing blow to the ears. "Move," Hiram shouted into the storm. Stepping onto the porch, he was instantly blinded. The world had vanished, no sky, no ground, no horizon. Only a solid wall of flying white particles racing past at 60 miles per hour. The cold struck him like a hammer to the chest, stealing his breath. It was otherworldly, a relentless cold from the depths of space, indifferent, absolute. He trudged down the steps, sinking to his thighs in deep drifts, leaning forward to carve a path with his body. The rope tightened behind him. He felt Olivia's weight, his family's weight, anchoring him to the earth. Turning left, he aimed for the road buried beneath the snow. He'd driven this path 1,000 times, knew every turn and fence post, but now everything was erased, the landmarks gone. Hiram lowered his head, tucking his chin to shield his throat from the biting wind as he pressed on, left foot, right foot dragging through the snow. Then came a faint, muffled cry. He stopped and looked back. The rope was taut. Through the swirling white, he glimpsed Olivia's dark shape stumbling, falling into the snow. Mason was there instantly, hauling her up and pushing her forward. Gritting his teeth, the dark thought returned fiercer. Darren Whitlock is dead. The house is empty now, just wood and moss. And now it's mine. He clung to that thought. It was easier to walk toward a claim than a prayer. In his mind, he pictured the rugged, thick-walled cabin. He imagined kicking down the door, then finding the frozen body of the engineer and pushing it aside to clear a path for Jack. It was a grim hope to cling to, but amid the blizzard and the wind howling like a banshee in his ears, he had no other choice. Hiram Kerrigan was no longer just a man of civility. He was a father, a grandfather ready to scorch the entire world, if it meant preserving the fragile spark of life flickering in his grandson's chest for just one more dawn. He turned back toward the void, tightened his grip on the rope, and stepped into that all-consuming, crushing white darkness. Inside the cabin, silence hung like a heavy, comforting blanket. Darren Whitlock rested in his armchair, weariness etched in every line. The leather-bound notebook lay on his knee as he recorded the 2,200-hour log, noting the interior temperature remained steady. At 64 degrees, the storm outside had ceased to feel like weather. It had become a relentless, haunting backdrop, a steady, vibrating roar that the mind eventually learned to block out like an ever-present phantom. Darren lay curled on the rug near the stove, deeply asleep. His legs twitched as he chased phantom rabbits through dreamlike fields. Then suddenly Darren's eyes shot open, though his head stayed low, tension coiling in every muscle. His ears turned sharply toward the wind's ambient roar, straining to catch a whisper beyond the tempest's howl. Then came a low, urgent growl deep from his chest, a rumble that shook the floor beneath them. Darren's gaze lifted, tension tightening his brow. "What is it, boy?" Darren sprang to his feet, sprinted to the heavy oak door, and pressed his nose against the narrow crack at its base. He didn't bark. Instead, he looked back at Darren and let out a piercing, desperate whine that shattered the room's fragile calm. Darren frowned, rising slowly to his feet. He approached the door, placing his hand firmly against its cold wood. He felt only the wind's vibration, then heard it not a knock, but a dull, heavy thud, as though a sack of wet grain had been slammed against the exterior planks, followed by faint, muffled scratching. Without hesitation, Darren recognized the sound, the faint struggle of something dying, begging for entry. He threw back the heavy iron bolt of the inner door. This was the moment of truth. He had built a vestibule, a small airlock room about 4 feet deep, designed specifically to shield the living space from the full force of the wind. Stepping into the unheated vestibule, he closed the inner door behind him. The cold bit hard, but the air was still. He reached for the outer door latch, bracing his shoulder against the wood, knowing the wind would try to wrench it away. He lifted the latch and pushed the door burst open, catching the full fury of the gale. A blinding vortex of white snow whipped around him. Through that swirling chaos, Darren saw a dark, shapeless figure lying at the foot of the porch steps. He lunged forward, grasping the form. It was a coat and arm, and the weight was crushing as he dragged the figure upward. Hauling them onto the steps and into the vestibule, a jolt of realization hit him. A rope was tied around the waist. Hand over hand, Darren pulled the rope, hauling a second figure from the blizzard, then a third, then a fourth. Like fish caught on the trot line and dragged from the icy depths, Darren pulled each frozen body into the refuge. Finally, with all his strength spent, he hauled the last figure inside. He slammed his shoulder hard against the outer door, battling the fierce wind, until the latch finally clicked shut, instantly cutting the roar of the storm in half. The vestibule was crowded with a flock of snow-covered, gasping souls shivering from the cold. Darren flung open the inner door, releasing a wave of golden warmth, scented with wood smoke and orange peel flooding the cramped space. "Get inside," Darren ordered with urgency. He helped them stumble into the main room, where they collapsed in a tangled heap of limbs.